Rebecca had been with Hartwell Industries for almost 9 years. 9 long years of climbing the corporate ladder, stepping on whoever she needed to along the way. Now, as regional manager of operations, she had her own corner office on the 15th floor with windows that looked out over downtown. She had power, respect, and a salary that let her buy designer handbags without checking the price tag first. She liked reminding people how far she'd come. Started as an assistant, worked weekends, skipped vacations, and clawed her way to the top. Nobody handed her anything. So when she saw people who didn't match her standards of professionalism, people who looked like they shopped at discount stores or couldn't afford a decent car, she felt entitled to her judgment. In her mind, she'd earned that right. The IT department was on the 3rd floor, tucked away where most executives never bothered to visit. That's where David worked. He was 24, fresh out of a 2-year technical program at the community college. He'd been with the company for about 6 months, always the first one in and usually the last to leave. His job was basic tech support, helping people reset passwords, fixing printer issues, installing software updates. Nothing glamorous. David wore the same 3 polo shirts in rotation. One was navy blue, one was gray, and one was black with a small coffee stain near the bottom that never quite washed out. His khaki pants had seen better days, and his sneakers were the kind you'd find at a discount store, not the trendy kind that cost $200. He brought lunch from home every single day, usually leftovers in an old plastic container, and he took the bus to work, rain or shine, because his beat-up Honda was on its last legs and he was saving every penny to keep it running. Rebecca first really noticed him during a department meeting about 3 months after he'd started. The company was rolling out a new software system, and the IT director had brought David along to explain the technical side. David was nervous, you could tell. He had his notes printed out, and his hands shook a little as he pulled up his presentation on the projector. He started explaining how they could implement the new system without buying expensive new servers. There was this workaround, he said, using the existing infrastructure but configuring it differently. It would save the company around $50,000, maybe more. He'd done the math, run the tests on a virtual setup. His voice got stronger as he talked, more confident. You could tell he knew his stuff. Rebecca was sitting at the head of the table checking her phone. She looked up halfway through his explanation and interrupted him. Sorry, are we really taking budget advice from someone who looks like they shop in the clearance section? The room went completely silent. David stopped mid-sentence. His face turned red, starting at his neck and creeping up to his ears. A few people looked down at their papers. The IT director opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closed it again. Rebecca laughed, but she was the only one. I'm just saying, maybe we should leave financial decisions to people who understand quality. No offense. David gathered his papers with shaking hands. He closed his laptop, unplugged it from the projector, and walked out. He didn't say a word. The meeting continued like nothing happened, though a couple of people kept glancing at the door he'd left through. That should have been the end of it. But for Rebecca, it was just the beginning. She'd found a target, someone safe to punch down at, someone who wouldn't fight back. Over the next few weeks, she started calling him Clearance Rack Dave in emails. Not to his face, but in messages to her team, sometimes copying other department heads. Can someone who's not Clearance Rack Dave take a look at this? Or I need actual expertise on this, not the discount version. Her assistant would giggle when she said it. A few others joined in, wanting to stay on her good side. When Rebecca's computer had issues, the IT department would send David to fix it. She made a game of it. She'd make him wait outside her office, sometimes for 15 or 20 minutes, while she finished important calls that were really just her scrolling through social media. When she finally let him in, she'd watch him work without saying anything, then complain that it took too long. Once, he'd spent 2 hours putting together a detailed security report she'd requested. It was thorough, well-organized, with charts showing potential vulnerabilities in the company's network. She sent it back with a sticky note that just said, "Even your font choice screams amateur. Redo this." David never talked back, never argued, never even made eye contact with her if he could avoid it. He'd just nod, say, "Yes, ma'am," and do whatever she asked. Then he'd go back to his desk on the 3rd floor and keep working. What Rebecca didn't know was that David was working a lot. Not just his regular hours, but late into the night, sometimes until the cleaning crew came through at 10 p.m. He was teaching himself advanced network administration through online courses. He was documenting every system in the building, learning how everything connected, finding inefficiencies that nobody had bothered to look for. His co-workers in IT started noticing. The servers never crashed when David was monitoring them. Problems got fixed before they became emergencies. The IT director, a guy named Peterson who'd been with the company for 15 years, started giving David bigger projects. Nothing public, nothing that would put him in front of executives again. Just important back-end work that kept everything running smooth. But Rebecca didn't see any of that. She just saw a kid in cheap clothes who took the bus. Someone beneath her. Someone she could use to make herself feel bigger. The other employees noticed, though, the way she treated him. The comments. The emails. Some of them felt uncomfortable but didn't say anything because Rebecca had power and they didn't. A few people started being extra nice to David, offering him snacks from the break room or making small talk when they saw him. A quiet kind of apology for what they were watching happen. David would smile and thank them, then get back to work. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there because he needed the job. He had student loans to pay, rent to cover, and a mother back home who sometimes needed help with her medical bills. He couldn't afford to lose this position, so he kept his head down and took whatever Rebecca dished out. Rebecca went home every night to her luxury apartment, poured herself expensive wine, and never thought twice about the young man whose day she'd ruined. She'd sleep soundly, wake up refreshed, and do it all over again. David went home to his small studio apartment, ate ramen for dinner, and stayed up late studying network security protocols. Neither of them knew it yet, but things were about to change. The corporate world has a funny way of turning tables when you least expect it. And Rebecca was about to learn that the person you step on while climbing up might be the same person who decides whether you come back down. 3 months had passed since that first meeting, and Rebecca's treatment of David had become a regular thing. It wasn't just occasional anymore. It was constant, calculated. She'd found someone she could pick on without consequences, and she was taking full advantage of it. The worst part was how public she made it. During a company-wide video call about new security protocols, David was presenting updates on firewall protections. He was explaining a vulnerability he'd discovered and patched before it could become a problem. Rebecca unmuted herself halfway through. "Quick question," she said, and everyone could hear the smirk in her voice. "Does your budget extend to presentation skills classes, or are we stuck with this?" A few people on the call laughed nervously. David's face went blank. He finished his presentation in half the time, rushing through the important parts just to get it over with. When the call ended, he sat at his desk staring at his screen for a solid 10 minutes without moving. His co-worker at the next desk, an older guy named Tom who'd worked in IT for 20 years, rolled his chair over. "Don't let her get to you, kid," Tom said quietly. "She's been like this forever. Chews people up and spits them out." "I'm fine," David lied. "No, you're not. But you will be. Just keep doing what you're doing. Good work doesn't go unnoticed forever." David wanted to believe him, but it was getting harder. Every day brought some new humiliation. Rebecca started sending system requests directly to him with impossible deadlines. Need this done by end of day for projects that should take a week. When he'd stay late to finish them, she'd complain they weren't thorough enough. When he took the proper time to do them right, she'd complain he was slow. She started CCing his manager on emails pointing out tiny mistakes. A misspelled word in a technical document. A report submitted at 5:02 p.m. instead of 5:00 p.m. Things that didn't matter, but she made them seem like huge failures. His personnel file was filling up with her complaints, even though his actual work was flawless. The breaking point almost came during the annual office party. It was held at a fancy hotel downtown, the kind of place with crystal chandeliers and waiters in bow ties. Rebecca showed up in a designer dress that probably cost more than David made in a month. She held court near the bar, surrounded by other managers laughing loudly and drinking champagne. David almost didn't go. He'd bought a new shirt for the occasion, the first new piece of clothing he'd purchased in 6 months. It was just a basic button-down from a department store, nothing fancy, but it was clean and pressed, and he thought he looked decent. Rebecca spotted him within 5 minutes. "Oh, wow. Look, everyone. Clearance rack Dave cleaned up. Did they have a sale at the secondhand store?" The group around her went quiet. A couple people drifted away, suddenly very interested in the appetizer table, but a few stayed, their silence just as bad as laughter. David turned around and left. He didn't make a scene, didn't say anything. Just walked out of the hotel and waited 40 minutes for the bus in the cold December air. He sat on that bench thinking about quitting, about how much easier it would be to just find another job, somewhere he didn't feel like dirt every single day. But then he thought about his student loans, his mom's medication costs, the rent that was due in 2 weeks. He couldn't afford to quit without something else lined up, and he couldn't exactly ask Rebecca for a reference. So he came back the next Monday and kept working. But something shifted in David during those 40 minutes on that cold bench. He stopped trying to be invisible, not in a confrontational way, but he stopped shrinking. He started documenting everything. Every request Rebecca made, every deadline, every complaint. He kept a detailed log with timestamps and email trails. Not because he planned to do anything with it, just because he needed to prove to himself that he wasn't crazy, that this was really happening, and he doubled down on his actual work. If Rebecca wanted to judge him by his clothes and his paycheck, fine. He couldn't control that, but he could control how good he was at his job. He started coming in at 6 a.m. before anyone else arrived. He'd map out the entire network infrastructure, finding redundancies and inefficiencies. The company was paying for software licenses they didn't need, running servers that could be consolidated, using outdated security protocols that left them vulnerable. David built a complete audit in a private folder on his computer. Every problem, every solution, every dollar the company was wasting. He wasn't sure what he'd do with it. Maybe nothing, but it felt good to be building something real while Rebecca was busy tearing him down. Peterson, the IT director, started noticing the changes David was making. Small improvements that made big differences. Faster network speeds, better security, fewer system crashes. "You've been busy," Peterson said one morning, looking over some of David's documentation. "Just trying to stay ahead of problems," David replied. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Best our systems have run in years." Peterson didn't know about Rebecca's harassment. He worked in a different building most days, only coming to the main office for meetings. He saw David as a quiet, hard-working kid with potential. He didn't see the daily humiliation. Meanwhile, Rebecca's department was struggling. Employee turnover was through the roof. 3 people had quit in the past 2 months alone. Exit interviews mentioned toxic management and hostile work environment, but HR filed the reports away without action. Rebecca had seniority. She brought in results even if her methods were questionable. The company valued productivity over employee satisfaction, or at least, they had until now. The company was heading into annual budget reviews, and for the first time in 5 years, they were facing serious financial pressure. A competitor had undercut them on several major contracts. Profit margins were shrinking. The board was demanding cost cuts across every department. The CEO sent out a memo. Every division needed to identify ways to reduce expenses by 15%. No exceptions. Managers had 3 weeks to submit proposals. Rebecca panicked. Her department was already running lean. She'd cut everywhere she could think of. Office supplies, travel budgets, overtime pay. She called meeting after meeting, demanding her team come up with ideas. But there was nothing left to cut without eliminating positions, and she wasn't about to put her own job at risk by reducing headcount. David heard about the budget crisis through the usual office gossip. He sat at his desk that night, long after everyone else had gone home, and looked at his audit file. 6 months of work, detailed analysis of every system, every expense, every inefficiency. In the entire company's IT infrastructure, he'd found over $2 million in potential savings, $2 million that nobody knew about except him. David stared at that number on his screen. He thought about Rebecca, about the mocking, the emails, the party, every small cruelty that had piled up into a mountain of resentment. He could delete this file right now. Keep his head down. Let the company struggle while Rebecca scrambled to meet the budget requirements. It would be so easy to just let her fail, but that wasn't who David was. As much as he hated what she'd put him through, he wasn't vindictive. He was just a kid trying to do good work and make a living. He saved the file, backed it up to 3 different locations, and sent an email to Peterson requesting a meeting. The subject line read, "Potential cost savings, urgent review needed." He hit send at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, then packed up his things and headed home on the last bus of the evening. David had no idea that email would change everything, not just for him, but for Rebecca, for the entire company, and for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't matter because of what they wore or where they came from. Sometimes the quietest people are just waiting for their moment to speak. Peterson opened David's email at 6:30 the next morning. He was drinking his first coffee of the day, expecting the usual overnight system alerts and routine updates. Instead, he found himself staring at a 47-page document that made him sit up straight in his chair. He read it once quickly, then again slowly. Then he picked up his phone and called David. "How long have you been working on this?" Peterson asked. No greeting, no small talk. David was on the bus, hadn't even made it to the office yet. "About 6 months on and off, mostly after hours. Can you be in my office in an hour? And David, don't mention this to anyone yet." "Yes, sir." Peterson spent that hour going through the document line by line. David had documented everything. Redundant software licenses costing $340,000 annually. Outdated server contracts they were locked into that could be renegotiated. Cloud storage they were paying for but barely using. Security systems that were doing the same job, just from different vendors. But it wasn't just a list of problems. David had provided solutions for everything. Specific vendors to contact, timeline for implementation, risk assessments. He'd even created a priority ranking system showing which changes would have the biggest impact with the least disruption. When David arrived, Peterson closed his office door. Something he rarely did. "This is remarkable work," Peterson said, "but I need to understand something. Why didn't you bring this to me sooner?" David hesitated. He couldn't exactly say he'd been too busy being humiliated by Rebecca to think anyone would listen to him. "I wanted to make sure it was complete," he said instead, "that every number was accurate. I didn't want to waste anyone's time with half-done research." Peterson nodded slowly. He'd been in corporate long enough to read between the lines. He'd heard rumors about how Rebecca treated people, but he'd never witnessed it directly. Looking at this quiet kid who'd done 6 months of extra work without asking for recognition or overtime pay, he started to understand. "I'm taking this to the executive team," Peterson said. "They meet Friday. I want you to present it." David's stomach dropped. "Me? I can't. I'm not good at presentations." "Maybe you could." "No," Peterson cut him off, but his voice was kind. "This is your work. You present it. And David, this might be the most important meeting you ever take. Don't underestimate what this could mean." The next 3 days were a blur. David rewrote his presentation 17 times. He practiced in front of his bathroom mirror. He borrowed a better shirt from Tom, the co-worker who'd been kind to him. It was still nothing fancy, but it was better than his usual rotation. Friday morning came too fast. The executive conference room was on the top floor, a place David had never been. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. The table was real wood, polished to a shine. Leather chairs. A projector system that probably cost more than his car. The CEO, Victoria Hartwell, sat at the head of the table. She'd founded the company 30 years ago in her garage. She was in her 60s now, sharp-eyed and no nonsense. Around the table were the CFO, COO, and heads of various departments. Rebecca was there too. She was required to attend all executive budget meetings as regional manager of operations. When David walked in with his laptop, her face went through several expressions. Confusion, then recognition, then something like amusement. She leaned over to the person next to her and whispered something. They both smirked. David set up his presentation with shaking hands. He'd gone over this 100 times, but now with all these people staring at him, every word had left his brain. "Whenever you're ready," Victoria said. Her voice wasn't unkind. David took a breath and started talking. The first few minutes were rough. He stumbled over words, clicked to the wrong slide, had to backtrack. Rebecca was openly scrolling through her phone, not even pretending to pay attention. But then something happened. David got to the actual numbers, the real meat of his research, and his nervousness faded. Because this wasn't about him. This was about the work, the data, the solutions he'd found. He showed them the software licenses they were paying for that nobody used. $340,000 a year, just gone. He explained how consolidating servers wouldn't just save money on hardware, but on energy costs, maintenance, and physical space. He walked them through security redundancies that were costing them without adding any real protection. The room got quieter. People stopped checking their phones. The CFO started taking notes. David pulled up his implementation timeline. Phase 1 could start immediately and would save approximately $800,000 in the first quarter alone. Phase 2 requires some contract renegotiations, but I've already researched our legal options and drafted preliminary outreach to vendors. Phase 3 is the server consolidation, which is the most complex but also has the biggest long-term impact. What's the total savings? Victoria asked. Conservative estimate $2.1 million annually, potentially more once everything's optimized. The CFO let out a low whistle. And you verified all these numbers? Yes, ma'am. Every single one. I can show you the supporting documentation. Rebecca finally looked up from her phone. Her face had gone pale. She was starting to realize what was happening. This kid she'd spent months mocking was presenting a solution to the company's biggest problem, and he was doing it well. I have a question, Rebecca said, her voice sharp. This is all very theoretical, but has any of this been tested? Or are we supposed to restructure our entire IT infrastructure based on guesswork from someone who's been here less than a year? David met her eyes for the first time in months. It's not guesswork. I've run simulations on every scenario. I've consulted with 3 outside IT security firms to verify my recommendations. And I've already implemented some of the smaller changes on a test environment to prove concept. Everything works. Still, Rebecca pressed, this seems like an awful lot of responsibility to put on someone so inexperienced. What if something goes wrong? Peterson spoke up. Then I take responsibility. But I've reviewed David's work extensively. It's sound. More than sound, it's some of the best infrastructure analysis I've seen in 20 years in this field. Victoria was watching this exchange carefully. She hadn't gotten where she was by missing subtext. She saw Rebecca's resistance for what it was, and she saw something else too. She saw a young employee who'd done exceptional work without being asked, without expecting recognition, just because it needed doing. I have a question for you, Rebecca, Victoria said. Your department relies heavily on our current IT infrastructure, correct? Yes, of course. And you're aware we need to cut 15% from every department's budget? Yes, I'm working on proposals now. How much have you found so far? Rebecca shifted in her chair. We're still finalizing numbers. Rough estimate, maybe 5%, possibly 6% if we cut some positions. Victoria nodded slowly, then turned back to David. Your proposal doesn't require cutting any positions? No, ma'am. This is all about efficiency and eliminating waste. Nobody loses their job. Peterson, Victoria said, I want this implemented. Starting Monday, David, you'll lead the project. I'm authorizing whatever resources you need. David felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Lead the project? But you're the person who found $2 million we were wasting. That makes you exactly the right person. Peterson will oversee, but this is your baby. Run with it. Rebecca's jaw was clenched so tight you could see the muscles in her neck. With all due respect, this seems rushed. Shouldn't we form a committee to review? No, Victoria cut her off. We're out of time for committees. This is happening. Does anyone else have concerns? Silence around the table. Good. David, see HR after this meeting. We'll need to discuss your new role and compensation. You're being promoted to Senior Systems Analyst effective immediately. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. People filed out, several stopping to shake David's hand or congratulate him. Rebecca left without a word, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. David stood alone in the conference room for a moment, looking out those floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. 6 months ago, he'd been the kid everyone ignored, the one Rebecca used as a punching bag for her own ego. Now he was leading a multi-million-dollar project with the CEO's direct approval, he thought, about that night on the cold bench after the Christmas party, how close he'd come to quitting. Tom found him standing there 20 minutes later. You okay, kid? David turned around, and for the first time in months, he smiled. Really smiled, yeah, he said. I think I am. The news spread through the office like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone knew that David, the quiet IT guy Rebecca had spent months tearing down, was now leading a major company initiative. The same kid who rode the bus and brought leftovers for lunch was suddenly in meetings with department heads and getting consulted on million-dollar decisions. Rebecca heard about it in pieces. An email here, a hallway conversation there.
Each new detail felt like a small knife twisting in her gut.
When she saw David's name on the attendee list for the executive strategy meeting, she had to read it 3 times to believe it. She tried to maintain her composure, told herself it was temporary, that he'd mess up eventually and things would go back to normal. But deep down, she knew something had fundamentally shifted. David's first week in his new role was overwhelming. He had back-to-back meetings, vendor calls, technical reviews. Peterson gave him an office, nothing fancy, but it had a door and a window. It was on the same floor as Rebecca's department. She had to walk past it every day. The first time she saw him through the glass leading a meeting with 3 senior engineers, she stopped dead in her tracks. He was standing at a whiteboard, marker in hand, explaining something technical. The engineers were nodding, taking notes. One of them laughed at something David said. He looked different. Not his clothes, those were the same. But he stood straighter, spoke with confidence. He looked like someone who belonged there. Rebecca kept walking, but something bitter had settled in her chest. The HR complaints started surfacing around the same time. During David's promotion meeting with HR, the director had asked a routine question about his experience at the company. David had hesitated, then been honest. He didn't go into detail, but he mentioned that he'd faced some challenges with management communication. The HR director pulled his file, found Rebecca's constant complaints about minor issues. Then she cross-referenced and found something interesting. 3 other former employees had mentioned Rebecca in their exit interviews, all using similar language: hostile environment, public humiliation, constant criticism. HR opened an investigation. Quietly at first, they started interviewing current employees in Rebecca's department. Asked careful questions about management style and workplace culture. People talked. Once someone started, others felt safe to share their own stories. The assistant who'd laughed at Rebecca's jokes about David admitted she'd felt pressured to join in, or risk becoming a target herself. 2 other team members described similar treatment they'd witnessed or experienced. Rebecca had no idea any of this was happening. She was too focused on David. She watched him move through the building with new authority, saw people who used to ignore him now actively seeking his input. The CEO stopped him in the hallway one day to ask about the project timeline. Rebecca watched from 30 feet away as Victoria Hartwell chatted with David like he was a valued colleague, not some entry-level nobody. It was eating her alive. She tried to regain control the only way she knew how. She sent an email to Peterson questioning David's qualifications for the project, suggested that maybe someone with more experience should take over. Peterson's response was brief and ice-cold. David was selected by the CEO. If you have concerns, take them to her directly. Rebecca wasn't stupid enough to do that. Then came the department restructuring announcement. Victoria called an all-hands meeting on a Wednesday afternoon. The company was implementing David's cost-saving plan, which meant reorganizing how different departments operated. IT was being expanded into technology and operations, a broader division that would oversee not just computers and networks, but also operational efficiency across the entire company. Peterson was being promoted to vice president of this new mega department, and several existing departments, including regional operations, would now report to him instead of directly to the executive team. Rebecca's department was being absorbed. She sat in that meeting feeling like the walls were closing in. Her direct line to the executives was being cut. She'd now report to Peterson, who clearly valued David's opinion more than hers. And all of this was happening because of a project that David had initiated. The kid she'd mocked for his cheap clothes had just reorganized the entire company structure, and she was on the losing end of it. After the meeting, she tried to schedule time with Victoria. The CEO's assistant said she was booked solid for 3 weeks. Rebecca had never been put on a waiting list before. She'd always been able to get a meeting within a day or 2. It's somewhat urgent, Rebecca pressed. I'll make a note, the assistant said in a tone that meant nothing would come of it. Rebecca went back to her office and closed the door. She sat at her desk staring at the same city view she'd been so proud of 9 years ago. It didn't feel like an achievement anymore. It felt like a target on her back. Her phone buzzed. An email from HR requesting a meeting. Thursday at 2 p.m. Subject line, workplace conduct review. Her heart started pounding. This couldn't be about David. She'd been careful lately. Hadn't sent any mocking emails in weeks. Hadn't made any public comments, but she knew. Deep down, she knew exactly what this was about. Thursday came too fast. Rebecca, dressed in her best suit, prepared her defense. She'd been with the company 9 years. She had excellent performance reviews. So she'd been a little harsh sometimes. That's just what good management looked like. Holding people accountable, maintaining standards. The HR director wasn't alone. Peterson was there too. They had a folder in front of them, thick with papers. "Thank you for coming," the HR director said. "We need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding your management approach." They had everything: emails, witness statements, exit interview transcripts. They had a timeline of her treatment of David, complete with dated examples. They had complaints from other employees she'd barely remembered interacting with. "I've always been demanding," Rebecca said, trying to sound reasonable. "But that's because I expect excellence. That's what this company needs." "There's a difference between being demanding and being demeaning," Peterson said. His voice was calm but firm. "Multiple employees have described feeling humiliated and targeted." "That's not leadership." Rebecca's face flushed. "If people are too sensitive for corporate culture—" "Rebecca," the HR director interrupted. "We've reviewed your department's performance metrics. You have the highest turnover rate in the company, lowest employee satisfaction scores, and multiple harassment complaints." "Harassment? I never. Creating a hostile work environment counts as harassment. The legal definition is quite broad." The meeting lasted 45 minutes. Rebecca tried every defense she could think of. Blamed her team for being oversensitive. Said she was just pushing people to be their best. Claimed her results spoke for themselves. But her results weren't even that good. Her department was productive, sure, but mainly because people worked out of fear. And several of her best employees had left for competitors. The ones who stayed were either too scared to leave or actively looking for other jobs. "We're conducting a full review of your position," the HR director said. "During this time, you'll report directly to Peterson, who will be monitoring your department closely. We expect immediate and significant changes to your management style. And if I don't agree with this assessment," Rebecca asked, her voice tight, "then we can discuss separation terms. But I'd advise you to take this review period seriously." Rebecca left that meeting shaking with anger and fear. She went back to her office, closed the door, and for the first time in her 9 years at the company, she cried at her desk. Down the hall, David was in a project meeting. He had no idea about Rebecca's HR review. He was too busy actually working, solving problems, making the company better. He'd moved past her completely. That evening, Rebecca sat in her luxury apartment, the one she'd bought to prove she'd made it. She poured herself wine from a bottle that cost more than David probably spent on groceries in a week. And she thought about how quickly everything had fallen apart. She'd spent 9 years climbing, building her reputation, securing her position, and somehow in just a few months a kid in discount store clothes had dismantled everything she'd built. Not through revenge, not through office politics, just by being good at his job. By working hard while she'd been busy mocking him. The worst part was realizing that if she'd just treated him with basic respect, none of this would be happening. If she'd acknowledged his skills instead of his wardrobe, she might have had a valuable ally. Instead, she'd made an enemy. Or worse, she'd made someone who didn't think about her at all. Rebecca finished her wine and poured another glass. She had decisions to make. But tonight, all she could do was sit in her expensive apartment and wonder how everything had gone so wrong. Meanwhile, David was at home in his studio apartment, eating leftover pasta and reviewing project timelines for tomorrow's meeting. He was tired but satisfied. He was doing work that mattered, making a real difference, and he was finally being seen for who he actually was. Not the clothes he wore, not the bus he rode, but the value he brought, the problems he solved, the dedication he showed. That was worth more than any corner office. 2 weeks after the HR meeting, Rebecca was called back. This time Victoria Hartwell was in the room. That's when Rebecca knew it was over. The CEO didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We've completed our review," Victoria said. "Your position is being eliminated as part of the restructuring." Rebecca's mouth went dry. "Eliminated? You can't just—" "We can, and we are. Your role as Regional Operations Manager is redundant in the new structure. We're consolidating operations under Peterson's division, and frankly, your management style doesn't align with the culture we're building. This is because of him, isn't it? Rebecca couldn't help herself. Because of David. He complains once and suddenly my 9 years here don't matter? Victoria's expression hardened. This has nothing to do with one complaint. This is about pattern and practice. Multiple employees. Years of behavior. The restructuring just made it impossible to ignore any longer. The HR director slid papers across the table. You'll receive 2 weeks severance for every year of service. That's 18 weeks. We also need you to sign a non-disparagement agreement. Rebecca stared at the papers. 18 weeks. After 9 years, that's what it came down to. A severance package and a gag order. I need time to think about this, Rebecca said. You have until end of business today. Victoria replied. If you don't sign, the offer drops to the legal minimum. Your choice. The meeting ended. Rebecca walked back to her office in a daze. People in the hallway avoided eye contact. Word had already spread. It always did. She sat at her desk and looked at the paperwork. Then she noticed something that made her stomach turn. At the bottom of the termination form, there was a signature line for the authorizing manager. The position listed was Interim Operations Director, and the name typed below it, David Chen. She read it 3 times. David was now the interim director of the department that used to include her role, which meant he had to sign off on her termination. The kid she'd called Clearance Rack Dave would be putting his signature on the papers that ended her career. Rebecca wanted to laugh. Or scream, or both. The universe had a sick sense of humor. She picked up her phone to call anyone, but realized she didn't know who to call. Most of her work relationships were based on fear or competition, not actual friendship. The people she'd climbed over on her way up weren't going to sympathize now that she was falling down. At 4 p.m., there was a knock on her door. She looked up and saw David standing there, folder in his hand. He looked uncomfortable. They said you needed my signature, he said quietly. Rebecca wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him to leave. But what was the point? If she didn't sign today, the offer would tank and David would sign anyway. She was out of moves. Come in, she said, her voice flat. David entered and closed the door behind him. He set the folder on her desk and pulled out the termination documents. He'd already reviewed them, she could tell. There were small tabs marking where signatures were needed. The severance terms are fair, David said. I reviewed them myself to make sure. Of course he did. Because even now, even after everything she'd put him through, he was thorough. Professional. You must be enjoying this, Rebecca said. David looked at her for a long moment. No, I'm really not. Don't give me that. I treated you like dirt for months. Now you're signing the papers that end my career. You expect me to believe you feel bad about it? I feel bad that it came to this, David said carefully. But no, I don't feel bad that actions have consequences. You made choices. This is the result, Rebecca laughed bitterly. So philosophical. Is this the part where you give me a speech about karma? No. This is the part where I sign the papers and let you move on with your life. He pulled out a pen and opened the folder. His hand was steady as he reviewed each page one more time. Rebecca watched him, this kid who used to shake when she called him into her office. He wasn't shaking now. David signed his name on 3 separate pages. Clear, confident signatures. Each one felt like a nail in a coffin to Rebecca. For what it's worth, David said as he gathered the papers, I hope your next position is a better fit. Somewhere that values what you're good at without the need to tear other people down. Save it, Rebecca snapped. You won. Congratulations, you can stop pretending to care. David nodded slowly. I'm not pretending, but I understand if you can't see that right now. He left, closing the door quietly behind him. Rebecca sat alone in her office, staring at the walls. She had 2 hours to sign her own papers and clean out her desk. She thought about throwing something, making a scene, going out in a blaze of defiance. But what would that accomplish? She'd just look pathetic, another angry person who couldn't handle losing. So she signed the papers, packed her personal items into a cardboard box that someone from HR had left outside her door. Pictures, a few awards, her expensive desk accessories that now seemed ridiculous. When she was done, she looked around the office one last time. The corner view, the leather chair, the nameplate on the door, all the symbols of success she'd fought so hard for. None of it mattered. Not really, because she'd built it all on a foundation of treating people as less than human, and foundations like that don't last. She carried her box through the office at 5:30 p.m. A few people said goodbye. Most just watched silently. She passed by David's office. He was at his desk on a phone call, looking at something on his computer. He didn't even notice her walk by. That hurt more than anything. She wasn't even important enough to acknowledge anymore. Rebecca went home, opened a bottle of wine, and sat on her couch scrolling through job listings. With a non-disparagement agreement, she couldn't even vent on social media. She was just supposed to disappear quietly and pretend everything was fine. Over the next few months, she applied to dozens of positions. Some called her back. Most didn't. The ones who interviewed her asked why she'd left her previous role. She'd practiced her answer: company restructuring. But good interviewers could read between the lines. They'd call Hartwell Industries for references, and while HR wouldn't say anything legally risky, the silences spoke volumes. Meanwhile, David's project was a massive success. The cost savings he'd identified were real and sustainable. The company's financial outlook improved. Employee satisfaction in the newly restructured departments went up. Peterson got his VP title permanently, and David was promoted again, this time to Director of Technology Innovation. 6 months after Rebecca left, David finally saved enough to buy a reliable car. Nothing fancy, just a used Honda that didn't break down every other week. He still brought lunch from home most days, not because he had to anymore, but because he'd learned to be careful with money. He never talked about what happened with Rebecca. When people asked, he'd just say she'd moved on to other opportunities. Some people pushed for gossip, but David wouldn't give it to them. It wasn't his story to tell. Tom, his old co-worker, retired a year later. On his last day, he pulled David aside. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Tom said. "Watching you go through hell and come out the other side without becoming bitter. A lot of people would have used their new position to make her life miserable. You just did your job. What else was I supposed to do?" David asked. "Exactly. That's why you're going to be fine, kid. You understand something most people take decades to learn. The best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building something good." David thought about that conversation a lot. He thought about Rebecca too sometimes. Wondered where she ended up. If she'd learned anything. If she treated people differently now. He hoped she did. Not for his sake, but for hers. Because carrying that much anger and superiority was exhausting. He'd seen it in her face that last day in her office. Under all the bitterness, she'd looked tired. A year and a half after everything went down, David was leading a presentation for new hires. Talking about company culture and values. He told them about the importance of respecting every person in the building, regardless of their position or paycheck. "You never know who you're talking to," he said. "The person you dismissed today might be the person evaluating your work tomorrow. But more importantly, everyone deserves basic respect just because they're human, not because of what they can do for you." One of the new hires raised her hand. "Did you learn that here?" David smiled slightly. "I learned it before I got here. But this company definitely reinforced it." He didn't tell them about Rebecca, about the months of mockery and humiliation, about signing her termination papers. Those details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the lesson. Treat people well. Do good work. Success built on someone else's pain isn't really success at all. David had learned that early. Rebecca had learned it too late, and that in the end made all the difference.